My name is Monica Youn, and I'm a counsel at the Brennan Center. And as Laura mentioned a bit earlier, I spend quite a bit of my time defending campaign finance reforms in court. Professor Lessig had mentioned this morning that the term Fair Elections Now Act might be like waving a red towel in front of the Supreme Court. And I have to confess that as a litigator, as I was hearing some of the phrases that were being used this morning, phrases like enhancing participation or promoting competition or, God forbid, level the playing field, I had to cringe a little bit. I know that some of our clients who are in the room, we have taught to cringe a little bit at hearing those words because the Supreme Court in recent years has determined that those goals can be hostile to the First Amendment. I think that the title of today's panel is Money, Politics, and the Constitution, is campaign finance reform on a collision course with the Supreme Court. Those of us who litigate in this area have been very busy recently both bringing and defending a multitude of lawsuits. All over the country, new challenges to campaign finance reform systems keep popping up, even as we here in the room are discussing what new reforms we want to put onto the table. The cause of all of this activity is pretty straightforward. With the Roberts Court, certain opponents of reform have reason to believe that a 5-member majority of the court is skeptical of campaign finance regulations. In fact, in his majority opinion in Wisconsin Right to Life, Chief Justice Roberts said with regard to campaign finance regulation, enough is enough. The Roberts Court has struck down all 3 campaign finance laws that it has considered: Vermont's contribution and expenditure limits in Randall versus Sorrell, the application of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act to corporate campaign ads in Wisconsin Right to Life, and the Millionaires Amendment to BICRA in the Davis case. The result, Rick Hasson has called the greatest period of deregulation since the passage of the Federal Election Campaign Act. We now find ourselves in the midst of a concerted effort to constitutionalize and deregulate campaign finance reform, which would both strike down existing systems but also take many future options off the table. I have asked this panel to concentrate on, I think, 2 major fault lines in the case law about campaign finance reform. 2 questions that the court will need to answer, and 2 questions that reformers find themselves asking, both as a result of recent developments in the 2008 elections and in the economic meltdown, and as a result of the developments in the case law that we're aware of. The first question is, of course, the fundamental one, which is, can money be considered to be speech in the First Amendment sense? And if so, what, if anything, can constitutionally be done to regulate the impact of money in politics? And second, what state interest can be used to justify reform? Is corruption now the only legitimate reason that this court will accept in serving as a state interest that can justify campaign finance reform? Just briefly on the money equals speech equation, in the 2008 elections and with recent political scandals and the causes and consequences of the current recession have caused many of us in both the pro-reform and the anti-reform communities to focus with renewed emphasis on what does it mean for money to function as speech. For example, when we see a 90-year-old woman write a $3.12 check to her chosen candidate, together with a handwritten note that says she just wants to do whatever she can, afford to show her support, it becomes very hard to say that there is no expressive value that goes along with that check. But on the other hand, when AIG turns out to be one of the all-time top contributors to federal lawmakers and has given hundreds of thousands of dollars to lawmakers charged with regulating the insurance industry, things tend to look a lot less savory. But what else, as we've heard this morning so many times, can you expect from a system where legislatures commonly raise money by calling exactly those interests who are about to appear before their committee? But just to say that money in politics may have some First Amendment value is, of course, not the end of the question, but only the beginning. And, you know, it may be possible that we are reaching a point in time where versions of the First Amendment clash with each other. For example, in the FDR era, we will recall that the Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment's protections on freedom of contract to strike down a great deal of New Deal social welfare legislation. And Cass Sunstein, among other constitutional theorists, has argued that the way in which the court is reifying the money equals speech analogy in the campaign finance reform jurisprudence is a modern equivalent to the reification of freedom of contract that we saw from the New Deal court. If money in politics has First Amendment value, how does it affect the constitutionality of campaign finance regulation? And secondly, what are the interests that justify campaign finance reform? The case law has tended to focus on the question of corruption, not only corruption conceived narrowly as quid pro quo arrangements, but also in a broader sense that would encompass the appearance of corruption that Professor Lessig spoke about, and also circumvention, so that ways of, you know, various end runs, various games that we know that political players will play are also brought into that overarching concept of corruption. However, the Roberts Court has expressed some impatience, I think, with the expansion of this ideal of corruption to that extent. And, you know, one question that I guess constitutional scholars are considering is, are there other interests that can be used to justify reform? Zephyr Teachout recently published a very interesting article in the Cornell Law Review. We were hoping she could be here today, but she was not able to, which traces the history of what she calls the anti-corruption principle back to the framers. And what Professor Teachout suggests is that, like separation of powers, like checks and balances, anti-corruption in the Constitution should be considered to be a structural principle of constitutional law that would itself be a constitutional interest. So you wouldn't have a state interest going against the First Amendment, but you would have two constitutional interests weighing against each other. And there are other interests that the case law has not focused on to the extent that it might. For example, all of the dialing for dollars that we heard Representative Pingree speak about, that we have heard Senator Durbin speak about, the sheer amount of time and money that members of Congress spend in those little white rooms talking to rich people and corporations and not talking to their constituents. Is that something that that the case law is going to give due regard to? In the Davis case, Justice Alito's opinion for the majority suggested that leveling the playing field in the sense of leveling electoral opportunities for candidates of different personal wealth was not a legitimate governmental objection. And one question that comes up is, does this rejection of that narrow level the playing field focus preclude a larger view of political equality? Does it make those catchphrases that we were talking about earlier of promoting participation, of enhancing competition, of those sorts of things, are those values now off the table for reformers? And to talk a little bit to begin with about the history of the Supreme Court's case law in this area is Rick Hasen, who is the William H. Hannon Distinguished Professor of Law at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. And I'm truncating the biographies somewhat in the interest of time, but he's, of course, one of the nation's leading experts on election law, the co-editor of the Election Law Journal, and I get at least 6 updates from his election law blog pretty much every morning that when I turn on my computer. So we welcome Rick Hasen.